Welcome to Within the Frame, where we bring the most pressing issues across the globe into focus. I'm Kim Mok-yeon. In a major diplomatic move, South Korean President Lee Jae Myung is heading to Japan on January 13th for a South Korea-Japan summit. The visit comes at a time when both countries are navigating a fragile path between historical grievances and present-day strategic cooperation. From forced labor and comfort women to territorial disputes, long-standing issues continue to challenge any momentum towards reconciliation. Yet, with growing regional threats and global uncertainty, the pressure to move forward is even mounting. So tonight, we unpack the deeper meaning of the latest visit from a Western perspective. And for this, we're joined by Alexis Dudden, professor of history at the University of Connecticut. A big welcome, Professor.
Thank you so much.
So, Professor, let's begin right away. Like I've said, President Lee is set to visit Japan for a sit-down with his Japanese counterpart tomorrow. From a Western scholar's perspective, how significant do you think is this latest visit? And do you think it could mark an acceleration in shuttle diplomacy?
Well, I think given the state of the world right now, it's a very good sign. President Lee is just back in Korea from a very successful diplomatic engagement with China, and he's now off to Japan. He's almost the conduit, the stabilizer in the region in this respect. And, you know, given the stakes involved, I think all of his efforts should be greeted in Japan with the utmost sincerity, and I hope for the best for this visit.
Right, so we will be looking forward to some symbolic outcomes from the latest visit. But looking at the broader approach, Professor, South Korea, it has long followed the two-track strategy, separating historical issues from other forms of cooperation. So how effective do you think has it been in, balancing the reconciliation and stabilizing relations?
Well, as you mentioned, the same issues keep arising. The former sex slaves of the Japanese military, forced labor, Yasukuni visits, territorial issues, et cetera, et cetera. And some could say that that's a failure of two-track diplomacy, that, that people should just hit Japan hard. But that's not diplomatic engagement, and that's not in anyone's interests, least of all Korea's. So the two-track might better be understood as trying to keep the momentum going, because when Japan makes solid gestures and solid progress, beginning, for example, with the 1993 Kono Statement, then the region opens up and engages. The problem is, with a subsequent prime minister with perhaps a different support base, the rug gets pulled out, and revealing the problems with the two-track approach. And so the best approach I see is to just continue to build on the solid gains and come up with measures that really, I don't want to say shame Japan, but shed light on what has been achieved. And then when other groups in Japan deny that progress has been made, it's clear why South Koreans get upset.
Right, so actually separating the issues might maintain momentum, but it seems history always circles back. And yeah, but when we look at the root causes of this, what do you see as the root cause of the ongoing historical tensions between Seoul and Tokyo, and what structural factors continue to keep these disputes recurring?
Well, I think front and center, most important, is the need to understand the dignity of those who suffered is primary. And so just to treat it as, okay, we've checked off that box, we'll never have to address the issue again, makes no sense for people whose lives, hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people whose lives were ruined under both Japanese colonial control and war. To just say that they should get over it once one agreement is signed simply isn't how life unfolds, especially when a related issue surfaces and then that gets ignored or denied, or worse, told it doesn't matter, or called the victim or survivor a liar. And so really putting a dignified approach, respect for the need for addressing these issues, I think is really important.
Right. Like we've said, there are a lot of thorny issues between the two countries, but major matters like what you've said, the Comfort Women Agreement and forced labor compensation remain still unresolved. And South Korean President Lee has said international agreements should be respected on this point. So given this situation, what kind of approach should the South Korean government take, Professor?
Well, I think, the 2015 so-called Comfort Women Agreement, since there's no piece of paper, it really was a television show for all intents and purposes. And yes, the Japanese government did commit monies, which then, of course, became complicated by some survivors wanting to accept it and some survivors not wanting to accept it. And that's because nobody talked to the survivors in crafting the agreement in the first place. So I think what I would do right now, if I were in charge, is I'd return to a statement made by former Japanese Prime Minister Kan Naoto in 2010 on the 100th anniversary of Japan's annexation of Korea, when he actually acknowledged that the suffering of Koreans mattered and it would continue to matter. And if that could be taken, and it doesn't have to be, Korea is forever the victim, and I don't mean it that way at all. It's just to understand these people who have lived through such horrific circumstances and had the courage to come forward to tell their stories, which has helped countless related people around the world, they need to be included in any so-called agreement moving forward.
Right. So it seems to return to your academic perspective of, emphasizing the victim-centered approach when it comes to history. So, Professor, could you explain for our viewers what kind of practical mechanisms do you think are necessary to apply that victim-centered principle in the negotiating table?
Well, ideally, and when I say ideally, I am aware this is highly unlikely to happen. Best possible scenario is the Japanese Parliament, the Diet, adopts a measure acknowledging the truth of these claims. The Japanese Parliament, as such, would adopt the 1993 Kono Statement, for example, among other declarations. That would demonstrate the will of the Japanese people. That's highly unlikely. But then we could focus on more symbolic gestures, because each time little rumors of what's been negotiated behind closed doors emerge, it sends all sorts of shivers. And I think particularly of the statues around the world, the statues to the victims, the peace statues to comfort women. These are very small places for people to gather, to remember and learn from a truly horrific history. And in an age in which histories and memories are so hotly contested in so many countries, I find it deeply curious that only Japan is seeking to tear down a victim of horror, not a perpetrator. And so I think it's really important for the South Korean government to stand firm on the significance of this representation of one particular aspect of the so-called history disputes between the countries.
Right. It really is a very complex issue, considering the geopolitical and domestic politics situation. But we'll hope for these things to be recovered and resolved in the future. But on a related note, going back to the latest summit, this summit, it might address historical topics previously left off the table, like recovering remains from the Chosek coal mine. Professor, what significance do you see in raising humanitarian issues right now? And do you think it could be a meaningful triggering point for deeper reconciliation?
I think that's an excellent question, and I really hope this issue comes to the fore. It's different from the Sado mine controversy, for example. The Jose mine, the collapse that happened in 1942 was a terrible tragedy that involved both Korean and Japanese victims. The Korean victims predominantly, I believe there were around 140 people trapped and drowned when the underwater mine collapsed. There were also roughly 40 Japanese miners in there. And the combination of all of these lives together is really revelatory in terms of how history at the time was happening. And the fact that since the early 1990s, Japanese civic groups led by a local high school teacher, for example, have brought this history to the fore is really how a lot of these inner histories, these histories of interconnection between Japan and Korea have been demonstrated, have had evidence brought to light, for example. And it's only this past August, as we know, that archaeological divers were able to recover bones from the collapse, and DNA analysis will prove what happened. But unfortunately, the Japanese government continues to punt on issues like this, saying, well, we can't be for sure, making it very comparable to the Japanese government's position, for example, on the notorious biochemical warfare unit in North China, Unit 731. And so again, it's in the Japanese government's interests to accept evidence. And this is a great opportunity because this is civic groups from Japan working with Korean efforts as well.
Right. So with that in mind then, Professor, so we are looking forward. We're expecting some of these issues to be discussed at the summit. Then in order for the summit to, bring about some concrete outcomes regarding these sensitive issues, what kind of conditions or approaches do you think are necessary to, ensure that we have some, visible outcomes?
Well, again, focusing on the dignity of not only the survivors and those who support them, but the actual substance of the histories involved. We're talking about some terrible events of the past that really deserve to have more light shed on them, so that the reasons for the angst, the reasons for the rancor from those seeking justice are better understood. And so, it may be wishful thinking, but the more attention paid to these various details of the 20th century, which seems so far long ago, actually help tell the story of why relations remain so complicated when the Japanese government denies they happened.
Right. So just to clarify, when you mean focusing on the stories of the survivors, focusing on the stories of the victims, then you mean when the two leaders actually discuss about this, right?
Well, I doubt they're going to actually raise these topics out loud. However, in working groups, in breakout groups, this is a great opportunity to recognize that Japanese and Koreans work together to unravel the shared history, which we all know is not just black and white, because the colonial era had lasted for such a long time. Simply saying that Japanese did this to Koreans really isn't the full story. And so I think it's in South Korea's interest, for example, to make the history of empire as broad as possible, as we just saw with President Lee in China, when meeting at the former Korean Provisional Government headquarters in Shanghai, for example, meeting with other independent survivors of independence activists. But when Chinese leaders say China and Korea have a shared history, they do under Japanese rule, and they do with people in the Philippines, in Indonesia, in Singapore, throughout the areas of the Japanese empire. And I think a strategy best for South Korea is to broaden the network of stories and approach it that way, so that it's not simply Japan versus Korea, Korea versus Japan.
Right, a very important point for us to shed light and highlight the stories of the victims themselves and make acknowledgement wider. That's a very important point. Now, Professor, let's switch gears a little bit to the Dokdo territorial dispute. It still remains a very big flashpoint. Last year, Japan's Prime Minister called Dokdo inherent Japanese territory, prompting a strong response, of course, from South Korea. So in your view, how should both governments actually manage this issue?
Well, how should I say this? In November, when Prime Minister Takaichi made her comments about Taiwan, we all know she was responding in open parliament to an opposition leader. When she made her December 9th comments about Dokdo, she was responding to a local parliamentarian from the Shimane Prefecture which claims these islands for Japan. And so that was really a clear act of domestic politics. I'll do this if you do that for me. But that's not statesman. That's not leader-like, which then leads to, I found really interesting. Several days ago, January 8th, Japan's Nikkei, Japan's version of the Wall Street Journal, published an editorial urging Prime Minister Takaichi to act like a leader. Territorial issues get us nowhere. Leave it alone. And so that was a very strong urging to her by a conservative group in Japan saying, we really do not need this flare-up because we know that that's a non-starter. And I do find interesting in sort of the last decade of Japan-Korea relations that, people will mess with victims, they'll mess with survivors. When who's really going to go to a shooting war over 100-year-old survivors from the 20th century's horrors? Territory is a different matter. And that's where this needs to be handled extremely carefully. And if Prime Minister Takaichi plays with Dokdo, then she can expect a standoff, unfortunately.
Right. So we could be seeing it as an act of domestic politics rather than a complete statement.
If I could just add, we know that February 22nd in Japan is what Japan celebrates as their Island Day, Takashima no Hi. However, if she chooses not to send a cabinet-level minister to that celebration in Shimane Prefecture, domestic politics, then that would be a statesman-like approach to this issue between the two countries. That said, if she chooses to send a cabinet minister, then it's the equivalent of almost visiting Yasukuni because people have warned her not to at a time when the region needs Japan and South Korea to get along calmly.
Right, definitely. So clearly all eyes will be focused on that date, which will come in a few weeks from now. Now, in that same context, Professor, you've said the 1951 San Francisco Peace Treaty laid the groundwork for territorial disputes in East Asia. So from a historical standpoint, how do you interpret this Dokdo issue?
Sure. So Article 2 of the 1951 San Francisco Treaty does not specifically name these islets, as we all know. In many rough drafts, these islands were named, but in the final treaty, they're not there. And so the Japanese government has long used that to claim that these islands are Japan's, which is that I won't even go into the sort of emptiness of that argument. That said, what it has done has inserted the United States into this problem because the United States, as the architect of the San Francisco Treaty, exactly knew what it was doing and left this question blank, requiring actual U.S. negotiation. At the moment, however, I strongly don't want President Trump to even think about these islands, right? I mean, he might, and I don't say that lightly, because this is a really delicate point on which, if this could just be left alone by the Prime Minister of Japan, then the region could have the possibility of remaining just about the only stable place on the planet right now, which is rather stark. But the problem is the San Francisco Treaty is one of strategic ambiguity. And so there are all of these little shards of the Japanese empire that have been left dangling and vaguely defined in the treaty. Meanwhile, it's been under absolute Korean control since the middle of the Korean War. And for historical reasons, is certainly Korean territory. All the evidence points to that. It's just this necessity of certain groups in Japan to grasp at straws of a once vast empire, and these small islands to them are just a piece of what they think that was robbed from them. And that's simply not the case. This is Korean territory, and it's just not worth shattering regional stability over them.
Thank you so much for your opinion on that, Professor. But before we wrap up our discussion tonight, we've touched upon how history was often used as a political tool from both countries. What kind of concerns does that actually raise? And also, as a Western scholar, what kind of advice would you offer for the Korean and Japanese governments regarding this?
Well, I'm not really sure it matters where I'm from, especially when my current government is weaponizing everything in its sight. But I say this because the weaponization of the past, the weaponization of history is really dangerous because it has nothing to do with history. It's memory politics, and memory politics are far more volatile. And what they do is they create certain preferred narratives in preference for evidence, in preference for the actual things from which we can learn to, I know it sounds empty, but to try to make the world a little better moving forward. And that's really where the survivors of forced slave labor, of militarized sexual slavery, teach us all, because their stories are their stories are unique to themselves, of course, but their stories are not unique to that particular moment of victimization. And unfortunately, such histories of horror continue to happen, which is why the successes that certain victims groups make, such as finding the history that militarized sexual slavery is a crime against humanity. And thus today, people can be persecuted for perpetrating it during war. And so really that's where dignifying the victims themselves rather than weaponizing their stories for political gain is in everybody's interests.
Right. So in the end, how history is handled and treated, not just being remembered, may actually shape the future of this relationship moving forward. Thank you so much for your insights tonight, Professor Dudden. We really appreciate it.
And Happy New Year. Thank you.
Happy New Year. And that'll be all from us on Within the Frame. Be sure to tune in again next time as we continue to explore the stories that matter. Until then, stay informed and engaged.